Hello everyone, I'm Will, and today I'm going to be talking about gerrymandering. For those of you who don't know what gerrymandering is, it is defined as the manipulation of boundaries of an electoral constituency so far as to favor one party or class. When looking at this statement, you might think, well, that doesn't seem like it should be that challenging or that controversial. You'd be quite surprised on the contrary. Gerrymandering in today's standards is when the boundaries of legislative districts are redrawn in the favor of the controlling party of that state. I'm here today to talk about the current state of gerrymandering in our government, and the current state that it holds within our governmental system cannot take much longer due to the constantly changing political demographics in our country today. It's wrong, it's ruining people's right to have their voice heard and to create change. It's holding back democracy. Gerrymandering came to be in the 1800s, specifically March 26, 1812, when the word was published for the first time in the Boston Gazette. This marks the day that the term gerrymandering was coined, and it stuck. Also, fun fact, gerrymandering is so dysfunctional as a practice throughout its history that the name of gerrymandering is pronounced wrong by literally every single person that has ever said it. Because the man who gerrymandering is named after, Elbridge Gerry, isn't pronounced as Jerry, but as Gary. But on a more serious note, gerrymandering has created an unfair political system that gives both parties the legality to steal voters away from the other. When hearing that both sides engage in gerrymandering, many people might think that if both parties get to do it, it must be even somehow, right? You'd be quite surprised. Gerrymandering has been around for more than 2 centuries, and within those 2 centuries, the original district lines are far and few between. Increasingly, your vote is being concentrated or packed into an area with like-minded voters, which dilutes its power and importance, and things are only going to get worse. Recently, a host of states have had gerrymandering cases go to the Supreme Court, including Wisconsin, Ohio, North Carolina, and Maryland. Currently, 2 cases are in the process of being ruled upon by the Supreme Court, Wisconsin and Ohio, and rulings are expected later this month. These cases are important because the verdict the Supreme Court decides will likely be the path that gerrymandering will follow for the next decade, either continuing to be very prevalent or seeing the limiting of the practice of gerrymandering. Most importantly, the reason I am talking about gerrymandering is because the use of gerrymandering over the last 40 years has tilted in the Republican Party's favor. The ruling of a case in 1986 of Thornburg versus Gingles was a Supreme Court case that banned racial gerrymandering, and it has affected the Democratic Party negatively ever since. Instead of putting minority politicians in power, like the ruling was meant to do by the Democrats, it instead led to the Republicans taking advantage of the system to create the very political climate that we have today. Not because of the ever-changing political demographics of the United States, but because of gerrymandering. Here are some numbers about gerrymandering, just to give you some perspective. In 2012, Republicans in Wisconsin took 48.5% of the state, but they filled the majority of the seats in their state legislature with 60 out of 99. In 2014, also in Wisconsin, Republicans took 52% of the total vote and turned that into 63 seats out of 99. In 2012, Democrats across the country got 1.1 million more votes than Republicans for Congress, yet Republicans still sent 33 more members to the House. One of the main problems with gerrymandering is the packing of voters into districts such that racial minorities and those with a particular political affiliation are grouped together and their influence is lessened in other districts. Statistics show that Black and Hispanic voters swing Democratic by insane margins. However, these legislature districts that were supposed to give people's political ideals more support by surrounding similar voters with more similar voters essentially creates what is called wasted votes. That hurt Democratic chances. This practice of majority-minority districts also has created districts that were formerly split into partisan votes to become easily won by Republicans without the votes that minorities give to the Democrats. Basically, this can all be tracked down back to the Supreme Court ruling in 1986 of Thornburg versus Gingles, when one ruling affected gerrymandering for the worse by creating a more divided political system that doesn't look or sound very much like a democracy by nature, but more like an artificial painting of lies and deceit. Gerrymandering is a threat to democracy and creates a non-democratic way for politicians to gain votes for their respective parties. The reason for gerrymandering is very simple. Gerrymandering isn't created by the people, it's created by legislators who get to pick their voters, not the typical democratic route you would expect. For this reason alone, the system of gerrymandering shouldn't be continued within our political system. The most foundational aspect of our democracy should be focused on the people of this country and not dependent on a system that exploits voters and diminishes their voice. Gerrymandering hinders the ability of the voters to have a say in politics, as well as making some voters more valuable than others, which is illegal since the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965. In 2015, the Supreme Court ruled that states could remove partisan politics from the redrawing of political maps. Currently, there are 14 states that don't have state legislature control the redistricting of political districts, but there are still 36 states where the state legislature does control the redistricting power. This is a step in the right direction. By taking the state legislature out of the redrawing of districts, there can only be a more equal chance for those states to have a realistic projection of its voting demographic. State legislatures are political bodies and do not always have the best intentions or interest of democracy at heart. So why should we continue to allow them to practice gerrymandering if it doesn't fairly represent our country? One question that continues to arise in gerrymandering is how these districts are made and what has made them the way they are today. The sheer shape of these political districts and why they seem so impossible to come up with naturally. The fact of the matter is that there are ways to find out just how gerrymandered some states are, as well as their districts, to get the result that they get from those said districts. An article by the Daily Tar Heel, a math professor at Duke University, simulated 24,000 plus congressional maps and only found 0.7 of the possible congressional maps to result in the 10-3 Republican lead in that state. That is 162 maps out of 24,000 that have the same result as the current districting situation. The fact of the matter is, the way that redistricting is done in such a way that there is a less than 1% chance of replicating a similar result in this type of case is not good at all. This further proves how gerrymandering must stop, and it gives an unfair political demographic of the state and misrepresentation. Another usage of math in gerrymandering is in 2000. George Bush took almost 35% of the statewide vote in Massachusetts. But with voting data used today to redistrict the state, it would be mathematically impossible. This is because if we did recreate that representation, it would have Republicans holding between 3 and 4 districts to replicate the 35% vote that Bush took. Except that's impossible because those voters were spread across in different districts, and the Democrats not only won 9-0 in those districts, that would be the only possible scenario statistically and in reality. Gerrymandering is and has created a political travesty that has no clear end in sight. The overall misconception that has become reality in politics is due to the fact that gerrymandering exists. It is a way to manipulate voters in ways that work for the legislature and not the legislature working for the people and the state. The only apparent consistency within gerrymandering is that both parties do it. It is not possible to say that anyone is guilty when it comes to the situation of gerrymandering because everyone is. Granted, the Republican Party has gerrymandered to more extremes and have gotten the better half of gerrymandering rulings over the past 40 years when they have occurred, but don't let that take away from states like California, Texas, and Maryland, where Democrats have redistricted more and much in those states to their favor. The problem overall is that gerrymandering isn't a progressive or proactive system to be using in the modern era with all the intuitive technologies and advanced thinking that we have today, and because of our societal advancement that should lead us to think in smarter ways. Gerrymandering is a practice and idea of the past. It is outdated, undemocratic, unethical, and is slowly tearing our country apart. This is why gerrymandering should be ended by the Supreme Court on a political level, because it can only do harm to our democracy. It cannot help it anymore.